Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today's Wednesday, December 13th, and it's day 68. An update on what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Just today, The Guardian reported that Israel's foreign minister announced that the war will continue with or without international support. The foreign minister of Israel said a ceasefire at this current stage would be a gift to the terrorist organization of Hamas and would allow it to return and threaten the residents of Israel. As you know, we at Churches for Middle East Peace stand strongly in favor of a comprehensive ceasefire and fundamentally believe it's not only in the best interest of the people of Gaza, but also the best interest of the people of Israel. Yesterday, there was a resounding vote at the United Nations General Assembly calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. President Joe Biden warned the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu that he's losing international support. And at the UN General Assembly, the vote was 153 in favor, 10 against, and 23 abstention. The non-binding vote is largely symbolic. Again, this was in the General Assembly, but it serves as an important barometer of world opinion. None of the major powers joined Israel and the United States in their opposition to a ceasefire. Israel and the US have shown their sharpest public disagreement yet over their conduct and the future in terms of the response to the future of the war against Hamas. And as we just showed in the United Nations, they're becoming increasingly isolated by global calls for a ceasefire. Biden said that Israel has the European Union, Europe, and most of the world supporting them, but they're starting to lose support because of the indiscriminate bombing that takes place. Israel's military campaign has left much of northern Gaza obliterated. More than 18,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to authorities in Gaza, and more than 80% of the population of 2.3 million people have been displaced. And those are numbers we've been sharing with you regularly. And Israel has called on the international community to act effectively and aggressively in order to protect global shipping lanes. That's in response to the Yemen's Houthi rebels' attacks on shipping. They have said that they will continue to attack any ships that are in the Red Sea until Gaza has received humanitarian aid. There have been discussions about the potential of a continued ceasefire. We heard from a senior U.S. official in the news that those have hit a dead end, and a news network in Qatar also communicated that Hamas has not been responsive in terms of conversations about returning to negotiations in terms of a continued ceasefire. We also know 2 Israeli commanders and 7 soldiers were killed by Hamas in an ambush in Gaza City, an area that has seen intense urban fighting in recent days. This was one of the most lethal incidents for Israel and for soldiers in Gaza in the last 2 months since things began on October 7th. And the latest Israeli combat deaths are coming amid fears of a rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis, which we've been talking about regularly in terms of what's happening in Gaza. There are starting to be increased heavy winter rains. Cool weather is present and will only increase as winter continues. Aid agencies have reported dwindling food stocks, and that the vast number of Palestinians that are affecting the vast number of Palestinians who've been displaced. The commissioner of the UN relief agency, UNRWA, said that conditions in Gaza are a living hell. Lazzarini told a meeting in Geneva he returned from last night. This was, he had his 3rd visit to Gaza, and he described it as distressing. He said there's no more food to buy, even for those who have money. In the shops, all of the shelves are empty. Israel also, in the last 24 hours, carried out another raid in Jenin in the occupied West Bank. I gave a significant report on the number of Palestinian deaths in the West Bank in my update yesterday, and there were a number of wounded civilians with various injuries. And the European Commission President Ursula von Leyen gave her backing to the idea of the EU imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers responsible for attacks, which would follow some of the actions of the US and other countries. Pope Francis renewed his call for an immediate ceasefire, saying, "May this great suffering of Israelis and Palestinians be over." And in that regard, many of you joined us on Monday night in Washington, D.C. or online. We had a Christmas ceasefire service. There were also Hanukkah protests at the White House calling for a ceasefire. I would encourage you, if you have not seen that service, we have it online on our YouTube page. It was incredibly powerful. I have been sick. Unfortunately, I was not able to be present, but I was watching online and was with people in spirit. And religious news services wrote an article on the calls for ceasefire on Capitol Hill. And I wanted you to know that our calls for peace are making a difference. So please continue to call your members of Congress, continue to support a ceasefire. Just in the last day or so, an open letter signed by 140 interns and fellows working for Democratic and Republican offices on Capitol Hill came out with a statement, and they were stating that they're accusing rank and file of Capitol Hill in downplaying constituent calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, claiming that hundreds of thousands of messages from U.S. citizens and staff have gone unnoticed and unheard. The letter said this: "We believe Israel, like any other nation, has a right to defend itself and its people, but there's no justification for the wanton killing of innocent civilians. There's no justification for intentionally bombing hospitals, shelters, water supplies, religious sites, or schools. That is not there. This is no longer an act of defense. It's genocide," the letter read. "We refrain from telling our bosses how to do their jobs. As congressional interns and fellows, we owe it to the American people to expose the patent malpractice of Congress. We can no longer stand by while the voices of constituents are suppressed and ignored by their elected officials." They added, avoiding naming themselves for fear of career retaliation. But the interns also noted that some members of Congress have not been adequately briefed about the volume or contents of messages, and that despite congressional inaction, they would do everything in their power to ensure that a permanent ceasefire is achieved. To diminish the intelligence of people who support a ceasefire, to blatantly spread information within the office about the conflict, and to actively make other staff feel uncomfortable is appalling, read one testimonial included in the letter. There is a clear disconnect between what the American public wants and what our representatives are doing. So may we continue to pray for peace and to call for peace and to advocate for an end to the bombing of Gaza and for an end to all violence related to Israel and Hamas.